Well, the title of my talk is The Normative Mind in Defense of a Heresy. And the claim I would like to argue for is that the human mind is primarily or rudimentary normative. I'm not sure whether it's a heresy. I will leave the judgment in this respect to the audience. But what I can say is what is the structure of the talk. The structure is that I start with what I call the three dogmas of Cartesianism. Then I will put forward the normative mind hypothesis. Then I will try to adduce some arguments in favor of this hypothesis from the point of view of evolutionary theory. And I will finish with a conclusion. Now, let me say what the three dogmas of Cartesianism are. One thing before that, however, I do not claim that these are exactly the positions or exactly the theses which were held by Descartes himself. Rather, what I'm trying to picture here is what has become very deeply rooted in the Western way of thinking and is usually attributed to Descartes. The first dogma is the mind-body dualism, of course, which says that mind is ontologically separated from the body. And here is some textual evidence. In meditation, Descartes says, just because I know certainly that I exist, and that meanwhile I do not remark that any other thing necessarily pertains to my nature or essence, accepting that I am a thinking thing, I rightly conclude that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. And although possibly, or rather certainly, as I shall say in a moment, I possess a body with which I am very intimately conjoined, yet because, on the one side, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, inasmuch as I am only a thinking and an extended thing, and as, on the other, I possess a distinct idea of a body, inasmuch as it is only an extended and unthinking thing, it is certain that this I is entirely and absolutely distinct from my body and can exist without it. So this is the first dogma. The second dogma of Cartesianism is the mind-other minds dualism, which says that one's mind is fully separated from the minds of others. And again, some textual evidence for that, again taken from Meditations. Descartes says, but then, if I look out of the window and see men crossing the square, as I happen to have done, I normally say that I see the men themselves, just as I say that I see the walks. Yet, do I see any more than hats and coats which could conceal automatons? I judge that they are men, and so something which I thought I was seeing with my eyes is, in fact, grasped solely by the faculty of judgment, which is my mind. What we can see here is the route Descartes takes to establish the existence of other minds. Of course, it starts with the famous ego cogito, ego sum, then goes through the establishment of the existence of God, then to the existence of other bodies, and only after that we can judge that some of those bodies possess minds. So this is the second dogma. The third dogma is the perception-volition dualism, which says that one's mind has two separate faculties of perceiving and willing. And this time the quotation is from Principles of Philosophy, where Descartes says this quite clearly, that there are only two modes of thinking in us, the perception of the understanding and the action of the will. For all modes of thinking of which we are conscious may be referred to two general classes, the one of which is the perception or operation of the understanding, and the other the volition or operation of the will. Thus, to perceive by the senses, sentire, to imagine and to conceive things purely intelligible, are only different modes of perceiving, percipiendi, but to desire, to be averse from, to affirm, to deny, to doubt, are different modes of willing. What is worth stressing here is a very particular model of thinking, or more generally of perceiving, that Descartes assumes. It is a model of thinking as seeing. In the history of philosophy, we have at least two major metaphors by which we try to grasp what thinking is. The first both metaphors are present already in Plato and Aristotle. The first metaphor is the metaphor of thinking as seeing, of seeing ideas with one's mind eye. The other is the idea of thinking as a conversation which the soul has with itself. So these are the two ideas, and the philosophy of Descartes and other philosophers during the same time. So what they did, they assumed the model of thinking as seeing. When Descartes says that I can be sure of things which I see in a clear and distinct way, of course, in the background there is the metaphor of thinking as seeing. So these are the three dogmas, but I would like to stress again that there are many passages in various writings of Descartes which put the thesis that he held all those views to the full extent, let's say, into doubt. Now, when we look at the recent developments in cognitive science, before that, I would like to summarize this Cartesian view of the mind, which is based on the three dogmas I mentioned, as the descriptive, as the view which may be called the descriptive mind. Descriptive mind is something which is detached from body, detached from other minds, is a passive receiver or receptor of stimuli, and it is something whose main function is to depict the world. Therefore, on this view, the descriptive mind is a belief holder. Now, let us come to the next point, that is to what the contemporary cognitive science has to say about that. And here are three concepts quite eminent in this relatively new science, which in a way symbolize the rejection of all three dogmas I was talking of. The idea of embodiment, embedment, and enactment. Embodiment is a theory which says that cognition is situated in the interaction of body and world. A dynamic bodily process, such as motor activity, can be part of reasoning process, and offline cognition is body-based too. Embedment, although the term is defined in different ways, for the purpose of this talk should be understood as the claim which says that interactions with others are a necessary prerequisite for a fully functioning human mind to develop. And finally, enactment is the thesis which says that organisms create their own experience through their actions. Organisms are not passive receivers of input from the environment, but are actors in the environment such that what they experience is shaped by how they act. It is quite easy to see that by accepting those three ideas, we dispense with all three of Cartesian dogmas. A few more words about each of those concepts. I will not go into any details. I will just try to illustrate what they lead to, what are the philosophical consequences of adopting such stances. For instance, when we speak of embodiment, it has a very far-reaching, it does have far-reaching consequences for how we understand language. Here I dare to differ a bit with Professor Kozłowski, although I fully agree that human language is something which is more a product of cultural evolution, cultural transmission, that rather than of biological evolution sensu stricto. I would disagree that the basic, or that the way to our language started with singing or music or something like that. I would say I like another idea. I like the idea that it started with gestures. Why I like that idea? I like it because of probably the most powerful argument one can use in evolutionary biology or cognitive neuroscience or cognitive science in general. It is the argument from coherence. It is very striking that pieces of evidence from very different disciplines, such as neuroscience, I'm thinking here of the mirror neuron hypothesis, from developmental psychology, from primatology, and so on, point toward the thesis that our language is evolutionarily based on a prior ability to use gestures. There's another argument which are more sophisticated, I would say, which can be used in this context. It is quite difficult to say that human language is something which originated with music, for instance, or such abilities. When you listen to Matthew Kramer and look at his body language while he's speaking, I think this would be a kind of what philosophers call a performative contradiction. But anyway, this is only an idea I like because it fits well into my philosophical view. Anyway, the idea of embodiment is something which points toward those origins of language, that it comes from our ability to use gestures. Embedment. This is the example I would like to speak of a bit, is of a very important ability, cognitive ability we have, the ability of mind reading, or it is sometimes called the theory of mind. Professor Nęcka was talking about this during the first talk today. Mind reading is the ability to attribute to others some mental states. And now the question is, where does this ability come from? One of the controversies within this discussion is whether we need first to have some sense of self-identity, and only after that we can attribute mental states to others, or this is not necessary. Recall what the third of Descartes, or the second of Descartes' or Cartesian dogmas. What Descartes says, in fact, is that in order to understand that there are other minds, we need to start with understanding that we are res cogitans, we are thinking things, and then through a chain of reasoning we can arrive at the conclusion that other minds exist. Within the embedment approach, there is a different idea. It is quite technically, but I think quite well, expressed in this long quotation by Vittorio Gallese. I will not read it. I will just say that the idea is that the so-called mirror neuron mechanism is something which enables us to create the so-called, or what he calls, some intersubjective space of experience, something which precedes the feeling or the sensation, or however to call it, of self-identity. In other words, self-identity is something which would be impossible without creating this shared blended experience space with other minds. So in this sense, well, this is how the idea of embedment rejects at the very root the Cartesian dogma. The third thing, enactment. As I told you, in the history of philosophy, there were at least the two models of thinking: thinking as seeing and thinking as conversation with oneself. Now, on the basis of the idea of enactment, we should use another metaphor. And it is quite serious. It is not something to pour épateler bourgeoise. In the sense that when I'm saying that thinking is similar to dancing, I'm using a metaphor. But to say that thinking is something similar to seeing, or that thinking is something similar to a conversation, are also metaphors. Why the metaphor of thinking as dancing? That's why I put Camille Claudel's Le Valse as something which embodies, so to speak, the idea of thinking. It's much better than Rodin's Penseur. Why the metaphor of thinking as dancing is better than the other two metaphors? First of all, in this way, thinking is rooted in our motor schemes, as the idea of embodiment, embedment, and enactment require us to understand this. But further, it is something which is in between the other two metaphors. It takes the good feature, or it has the good feature of the metaphor of thinking as seeing, that is, it has spatial character. On the other hand, it takes a good feature of the metaphor of thinking as a conversation with oneself, because it is active in character. So this is where, philosophically speaking, those ideas would lead us. Now, just to stress again, the idea of the embodied, embedded, and enacted mind has had a lot of support from the research in neuroscience. I'm trembling a bit talking about mirror neurons in presence of Giuseppe, but at least in many contributions, it is underlined that conceptualization is realized via simulation, which requires the use of the same functional clusters which are used in action and perception. So the idea of embodiment is strictly connected to the operations of the mirror system. Mirror neurons are implicated in mind reading. So this connects mirror neurons to embedment. And mirror neurons link observation and action, which is strictly connected to the idea of enactment. Now let us come back to the problem of the mind as a belief holder. Within the Cartesian framework, we would say that the mind is a belief holder. What does it mean? Of course, belief is an attitude a person has whenever she takes something to be the case or to be true. But this leads to a view of the mind as something which is primarily descriptive. If we think of logic or epistemology, we usually start with the descriptive capacities of the mind. We have no problem in developing logics which are based on the notions of truth or falsehood. We have a problem when it comes to developing the logic of action, the ontic logic, and so on. When we think of epistemology, we started by developing criteria, explaining the methods of the theoretical discourse, and we usually have problems when it comes to explaining what normative discourse consists in. So it is within this view of the mind as a belief holder that the primary function of the mind is to represent reality, and that mind is primarily descriptive. And if we want to explain its normative functions, normative abilities, we need to start with the descriptive and then ask what to do next. Now, what I suggest in the normative mind hypothesis is to reverse the disorder, to start with the normative. Within this view, the mind becomes a problem solver. The goal of the mind is to orchestrate action depending on circumstances. And of course, this is exactly what the embodied, embedded, and enacted mind does. Of course, such a mind creates representations of the world, but those representations, at least at the beginning, phylogenetically speaking, are task-oriented. So they may be even false representations, but if they perform their function well, they are good representations. And now the key question is, how to get from the embodied, embedded, and enacted mind to our most sophisticated cultural outputs of descriptive character, non-commutative geometry, general theory of relativity, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and so on and so on. So my suggestion, again, maybe not my suggestion, but a suggestion I like very much, is that it is possible mainly to a very special way of solving problems our minds adapted, which is called rule following. Of course, I do not claim that we start with very sophisticated rules, as for instance rules of mathematics. My claim is that from the evolutionary perspective, but it is at the same time a phylogenetic perspective and ontogenetic perspective, we start with what I call rudimentary rules. Rudimentary rules are rules which are prior to language, in the sense that we do not need language in order for those rules to emerge. Of course, such rules may involve using an expression, uttering something, making some gestures. But language as a systematic phenomenon is not needed for rudimentary rules. It is the other way around. Because we have those rudimentary rules, at some point they evolved into a well-developed language. They are simple in the sense that they are not complex. They do not pertain to very complex patterns of behavior. They are concrete, so they always pertain to some concrete actions and not to some very abstract actions. For instance, I don't know, filing one's tax returns each year is at the same time non-simple, complex, and it is not concrete. It is stated in very general terms, so it means it's not a rudimentary rule. It may be a set of rudimentary rules. Now, the most important feature of rudimentary rules is that they are multi-aspect, in the sense that rudimentary rules pertain to entire actions, not just to aspects of those actions. When we think of any, I don't know, linguistic rule, it may say that, for instance, you should not use the word rich in reference to a poor person. This may be a linguistic rule. But it's a rule which pertains only to an aspect of a situation. Because there may be various circumstances in which you should not use this word. So such a linguistic rule is not a rudimentary rule because it pertains to some aspect of an action and not to the entire action. And of course, rudimentary rules are non-modal in the sense that they involve no deontic modalities such as obligation, prohibition, permission. They are just what is done in the given community. Again, with the rudimentary rules, there is connected the notion of rudimentary normativity. Normativity in the full sense of the word would be some feature of rules which enables one to, which is objective of course, but which enables one to justify action. In the case of rudimentary rules, we do have objective standards in this sense that rudimentary rules are publicly or socially shared patterns of conduct, but they cannot be used to justify action. They have no justificatory force, although they may be basis for correcting one's behavior. Now, the next question is, what makes the rudimentary rule following possible? And here I would point out to the human ability to imitate. In connection to imitation, one needs to distinguish between goal imitation and means imitation. When I imitate a goal of someone's behavior, I only try to make the same change in the environment that he or she did. If I imitate the means of his action, so it is means imitation, I imitate exactly what he did, his exact movement. Now, I will talk about this in a moment in a more detailed way, but right now I would like to stress that there is quite well-established claim that only humans use both kinds of imitations, so the so-called imitation sensu stricte, on a regular basis. Other non-human, other primates may be capable of using both goal imitation and means imitation, but not on a regular basis. But see what this imitation sensu stricte gives us. We learn at the same time to imitate goals and imitate action. This gives what I call a combinatorial explosion. What does it consist in? When we learn the pattern of conduct and the changes and how to make changes in the environment, we can recombine them. So we can use the same patterns of conduct to achieve different goals, or we can achieve the same goal with different patterns. So this is something only imitation sensu stricte gives us. Of course, this is the mechanism which makes cultural transmission possible. I will say a few words on this problem in a moment. Now, the mechanism I described, that is the mechanism of imitation, is something which is responsible for the emergence of culture as such, but among various cultural achievements, it is responsible for the emergence of language. When we have language, we can use it to reflect upon our rudimentary practice of rule following, and language enables what I call complexification, generalization, aspectualization, and modalization of rudimentary rules. So it enables us to for instance, pick some aspects of rudimentary rules, for instance, only what we call linguistic aspects, and formulate in language what I call abstract rules, in this case, linguistic rules. And my claim is that such descriptive abilities of the human mind, as storytelling, reason-making, theorem proving, are rooted in rudimentary rule following. Without the rudimentary rule following, we would not have the evolutionary scaffolding to build those descriptive abilities. Maybe reason-making is not a descriptive ability, but the others are. I also claim that such normative criteria as truth, if it is a normative criterion, correctness, fairness, efficiency, and so on, are abstract criteria, but they are built upon the notion of the primitive or rudimentary normativity, so the feature of the rudimentary rules. Again, without this primitive notion of normativity, this would be an evolutionary enigma that we came up with such notions as truth, correctness, fairness, efficiency, and so on. Now, I believe I have 10 minutes. Yeah. I believe that's, yeah. It's a proposition of content, right? That, in a way. Well, this may sound quite controversial, but I would like to dispense with the notion of belief. I believe that the notion of belief is a very bad notion to use as a central notion in the philosophy of mind. Why? When we look at the dictionaries, the English term belief means acceptance of something as true, at least from the 16th century. And if it is so, then there are at least two problems when we think about the content of the mind. The first is, what are the attitudes which do not aim at truth, but fairness, correctness, or other normative criteria? Are they beliefs of some worse sort, for instance? The problem number two is that if we claim that belief is any propositional attitude which consists in the acceptance of something as true, the mechanisms leading to the acceptance may be quite different. It may be a well-established discursive claim, something we discussed all over, or this may be a claim resulting from a mere gut feeling. So these are the two problems, but the problems get even worse when we look at how to translate the concept or the notion of the term belief into other languages. For instance, the typical way of translating it into Polish is to translate it as przekonanie. But the problem is that przekonanie is something which does not necessarily aim at truth. This is first. And because of that, it should rather be translated as conviction, from convincere, to argue, to persuade, to satisfy. So it has this kind of semantic flavor. Another interesting example, which I owe to Peter Jones and a beautiful book on the reception of Hume he edited, is to translation of belief as Glaube into German. Two different English words, belief and faith, are translated into German as Glaube. And when translations of Hume's work appeared, Hume's belief was translated as Glaube, but it was, in some cases at least, understood by the German authors as referring to faith, not to belief. What I would like to say is that what I like to call the lingua franca effect. So the language, which is the main language of doing some kind of research. In this case, it is English and philosophy of mind. Sometimes has a very bad effect on what kind of theories are constructed. But this is not only the case with the word belief. The same holds for reason. There is no intelligible way of translating reason from English into Polish in such a way that it has at least similar connotations. And in many moral theories which were developed in English, reason features as one of the main concepts. But we have also historical examples. The famous story is the story of the two Greek words, ousia and hypostasis, back at the times when Greek was the lingua franca of philosophy, towards the end of antiquity. They were translated into Latin, ousia as substantia, hypostasis as subsistentia. And accidentally, this led to a heresy, because people used those words in relation to God, His Son, and the Holy Spirit, but sometimes did not see the difference between substantia and subsistentia. God was one substantia, but three subsistentia. So it was just to note this kind of effect. Now, very shortly, the evolutionary perspective. This is a quotation from Michael Tomasello, who says that the 6 million years that separates human beings from other great apes is a very short time evolutionarily, with modern humans and chimpanzees sharing something on the order of 99% of their genetic material. The same degree of relatedness as that of other sister genera, such as lions and tigers, horses and zebras, and rats and mice. Our problem is thus one of time. The fact is, there simply has not been enough time for normal processes of biological evolution involving genetic variation and natural selection to have created, one by one, each of the cognitive skills necessary for modern humans to invent and maintain complex tool-use industries and technologies, complex forms of symbolic communication and representation, and complex social organizations and institutions. And Tomasello claims that there is only one possible solution to this puzzle, that is, there is only one known biological mechanism that could bring about these kinds of changes in behavior and cognition in so short a time. This biological mechanism is social or cultural transmission, which works on time scales many orders of magnitude faster than those of organic evolution. And the biological mechanisms which is responsible, which enables cultural transmission is, as I tried to indicate, our ability to imitate, but also our tendency to imitate. I will skip this part because I've been talking a bit about this already. And this is the conclusion of this evolutionary perspective. The phylogenetic perspective underscores that biological evolution has not equipped us with a set of independently evolved cognitive abilities, for instance, to use language, to construct mathematics, to follow moral precepts, but rather with a smaller adaptation for acting together. That this adaptation emerged in the context of collaborative actions, and so is a normative ability, and that it enabled coordinating action largely, although certainly not exclusively, by imitating others. This shows that something akin to rudimentary rules must have phylogenetically preceded our more complex cultural achievements. But now, if this is the case, if the biological adaptation that led to culture is relatively small, then the history of our descriptive abilities is largely something which can be approached only from historical perspective. So we are talking about historical time and not evolutionary time. And just one example, the example of where the concept of the law of physics comes from. Because if it comes from something normative, this is another argument in favor of my thesis. Michael Tomasello puts forward the following hypothesis. It is that human beings built directly on the uniquely primate cognitive adaptation for understanding external relations categories. They just added a small but important twist in terms of mediating forces such as causes and intentions. Just as primate understanding of relational categories evolved first in the social domain to comprehend third-party social relationships, human causal understanding also evolved first in the social domain to comprehend others as intentional agents. Many of the people of the world, when they are in doubt as to the physical cause of an event, often invoke various types of animistic or deistic forces to explain it. And this view may be strengthened by reference to a very nice essay written by Edgar Zilsel, The Genesis of the Concept of Physical Law. I will not go into the details. I will just say that Zilsel identifies two sources, historical sources of the concept of the physical law. The one is the so-called legal metaphor. So the laws of nature are depicted as kinds of legal rules. Like in the Old Testament, when he made a decree for the rain and the rain for the lightning of the thunder, then did he see and declare it, he prepared it, he and searched it out. And the word chok is used here. I know I'm out of time. Which is a derivative of to engrave, but used also for moral and ritual laws. In Vulgata, this is translated as ponebat legem. In Corpus Juris, there is a passage which says that nature has taught all animals the natural law. Pre-Socratic philosophers also use the corresponding term nomos. One of the first verses in which we have from the history of philosophy, from Anaximander, or the famous passage from Heraclitus about the sun. So this is one source, the legal metaphor. The other source is the concept of logos, which was more important for the ancient philosophers, or the Greek philosophers. But even in this case, there are some social dimensions, so to speak, or normative dimensions to the idea of logos understood as a structure of reality. For instance, Heraclitus says, having hearkened not to me but to the logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. And the word agree is a translation of the Greek word homologein, which has this normative aspects. The last quotation is from Thomas Aquinas, which only reaffirms that even in the 13th century, the same idea that the word, the structure of the world is in a way normative, was still there. So the conclusion is that the descriptive abilities of the human mind, such as theory construction, theorem proving, or storytelling, are all based on a less sophisticated binormative capacity to follow rudimentary rules, and thus that the embodied, embedded, and enacted mind is normative at its roots. The question is it a heresy? I believe it depends of one's denomination, of course, and I think that there are no many real Cartesians today. If they are, it is only through a kind of intellectual inertia. I've been also told that each and every talk should contain a joke, so it is with a joke that I finish. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Right time to you time for questions. I can say from evolutionary point of view that is certainly not heresy. I agree with almost everything you said. In evolutionary theory, we used to use the term preadaptation. Now it is not used, it's exchanged for acceptation, because preadaptation suggested that something was evolved before it could be used for something. And but the story is quite different. Old structures are used for new purpose. Yeah. And I'm sure that this was the way human mind was step by step developing without not too many major changes, biological changes, I mean. So thank you very much.
I can only react with a thank you.
Bartosz, thank you for the talk. Nice, very nice talk. I'm not going into mirror neurons, but I ask you a more general question about your normative mind and rule-following idea. Okay? It's a general question. Do you think, I mean, I agree with you that in many parts of the brain, I'm looking at the brain mostly, the brain has a powerful ability to represent rules, for instance, and follow rules. Especially, I think I just read in your book, probably the prefrontal cortex is one of these areas in which rules are represented at different levels. But it's also true that, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, there is not only rule representation and rule following, but there is also rule breaking. Something that also was today in our day talk, probably. And one maybe can think as the brain as a balance between this rule following and rule changing, and rule breaking. You know, sometimes rules is good to have rules so that you can exploit something you have reached. But then there are moments in which the rule following is not working anymore. Then you need to break the rule. And if the brain has not this ability when it's necessary, I think you will be stuck into following and imitating and not creating new things. So just a general. I don't know whether it's philosophical, but it's a general question.
Yeah. Two things, if I may. The first one is that the term rule following is itself quite vague. How I understand it is that there are at least two kinds of rule following. The one is what I call rule-guided behavior. This is something what Professor Nęcka with his colleagues tried to investigate. That it usually involves conscious decision-making process, whether to follow a rule or not to follow it. But this is a relatively rare example of rule following. The other kind of rule following is what I call rule-observing behavior. So it is doing what we've learned, but learned on many occasions in an unconscious way, by imitating others unconsciously. So we do a lot of things we do not have a conscious control over, but this also may qualify as rule following, because this results from the shared patterns of conduct that we learn somehow during the enculturation. Now, the second thing you mentioned is quite important. Of course, I tried to stress that I do not believe rule following is the only way we use for solving problems. What I try to say is that it is quite an important way, one of the ways, but quite important, because without this way of solving problems, there would be no culture as we understand it. Because culture, for instance, speaking language, is something which requires high fidelity. So it is something which would be impossible without imitation sensu stricto and what I call rudimentary rule following. And the final thing is that there are many studies. For instance, there are evolutionary programs which program agents, and they they run, and we see after several generations which kinds of adaptations are good or bad. And for instance, there are programs which, such scenarios which put imitation sensu stricto against emulation, for instance. And usually it is not, usually it is said that emulation seems better than, emulation is imitating only the goal of the action, not the action itself, that it is better. But I think that those scenarios overlook what I call this combinatorial explosion. That is, that imitation gives us an additional leverage in the fact that we can use the same mode of acting to attain different goals. And at least in the literature I know, there was no research including this aspect of imitation sensu stricto.
Okay, another question? We have another 3-4 minutes for questions.
Just in picking up on your response to the first part of your response to the last question, Bartosz, I just want to ask for, and I was wondering this while you were talking, for a clarification of your understanding of rule following. So I think, given what you've just said, it's broader than the conception to which Edward adhered in the first presentation today, or Edvard. And I'm just wondering about the following matter. Afterward, I spoke with Edvard about effortless compliance with the rule, of which the complying person may be well aware. So suppose, for example, just to take a couple of examples, suppose there are laws that forbid homosexual intercourse or the possession of a gun in one's home, and suppose that I'm utterly disinclined to engage in such intercourse or to possess such a gun in my home, and therefore my compliance with these laws is effortless. That is, even if these laws didn't exist, I wouldn't do the things which they forbid. But I might be well aware of the laws, so it's not as though my compliance with them is due to ignorance. It's just due to my law-independent dispositions. And I'm wondering whether you include that sort of effortless but aware compliance as under the heading of rule following.
Well, one distinction is needed here. As I might have mentioned during this talk, I distinguish between rudimentary rules and abstract rules. Yeah. It is only at the level of what I call abstract rules that you can speak of prohibitions, for instance, or you can identify any kind of deontic modalities. So if you are speaking about a law which prohibits buying guns, for instance, then of course I would say that even if someone has put no effort into not buying a gun, I would say that his behavior complies with an abstract rule. But it's a completely another problem at the level of rudimentary rules. Rudimentary rules is what is done in the given society. For instance, when I go to a bakery and buy some bread, I usually do not consciously invoke any provisions of the civil code. I just do what I do every day. I just do what is done in my community. So in a way, I would say that this is rather following a rudimentary rule. But of course, this act of following a rudimentary rule happens to be in compliance with an abstract legal rule. But now, when I go to court, and when I need to argue for my client, when I use the text of the civil code, when I use the commentaries, previous judgments, and so on, I may say that in this case, I'm trying to persuade the judge what is the correct way of following an abstract rule.
1 minute. Okay.
Hi, thanks. I agree with a lot of what you're saying about the difference between the descriptive mind and the normative mind. And I think this concept of rudimental rules is really good, and I hope it can sort of go forward and be picked up a lot. In terms of how you get from the normative mind to the descriptive mind, do you think that's purely a matter of cultural evolution, or is there a biological component to it?
Well, that's always the problem of how to distinguish between what are the biological and what are the cultural factors. What I would embrace quite easily is to say that when we look phylogenetically, first we needed something akin to rudimentary rules. So the first thing that must have emerged was something, it was already culture, but at this rudimentary level. But then when the new cultural achievements emerged, such as mathematics, novel writing, or whatever, it is not my claim that there were no other adaptations of biological origin that played a role there. As Professor Kozłowski said, that there are many adaptations which sometimes are used in new domains. So my claim is not that strong. It's rather than when we look phylogenetically, we need to start with something akin to rudimentary rules.